Welcome to the Last American Vagabond. Joining me again today is Derrick Broze to discuss just whatever the hell's going on in the world today. We haven't talked in a minute, and there's so much, really some very clear developments and stuff that we've been covering pretty extensively that we just wanted to connect on. I wanted to get his thoughts on certain things like Palantir, Detachment 201, possibly the wars going on, but just to connect in general, to kind of just touch base and see, how he's perceiving some of the different events, what's going on in Iran, foreign policy. So, Derrick, how are you today?
I'm doing great, brother. Thanks for having me back.
Yep, always a pleasure, my friend. So I think what's a good place to start in general is obviously the Palantir conversations. It's an interesting development. It's not, I mean, obviously part of it is sort of like, we tried to warn everybody kind of a moment, but at the same time, it's not so much about, it's about highlighting that it's a story that has clearly developed, in a lot of ways, like a lot of us were highlighting, but then the way it's been dealt with, I find really revealing. And so I want your thoughts on that, like the way that, because this became like a legitimate mainstream story, like exactly what we were trying to highlight, what you've been highlighting for a long time, and not just the abstract like technocracy discussion, but specifically how Palantir played a role, Peter Thiel, the connection to Trump's administration, and we talked about the black pill purity test point before the selection, how people responded to that, but then this worked its way into like legitimate, like on the front page kind of conversation. And then the way the mainstream alternative media responded to it. So, what are your kind of feelings about that? And start where you want in that. You can talk about Palantir, but I want to get into how you feel about the way people responded to it becoming so obvious.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see that. For one, of course, the main way that everybody, or a lot of people, especially in the kind of mainstream world, were learning about it was from the New York Times report about the Gotham program that local police are using, as well as the sort of Trump executive order, which I know we both reported on individually, which was meant to create less separation between federal agencies. And I've been kind of couching that development in the terms of this is part of the post 9/11 Commission report that said, well, we need to make sure these agencies can communicate with each other because according to the official version of events, the reason the 9/11 attacks happened is because, well, the FBI had some information, the CIA had some information, but legally they're not allowed to speak and communicate. So we need to tear down those walls and make sure that we can have more, streamlined conversation. And so Trump's executive order was about that, was about separating these organizations, these government agencies, which are kind of siloed in their own areas, and making it more streamlined, making so that the data could come, across different agencies. And that's the role that Palantir is helping with. So that was kind of like the mainstream version of events. Obviously, they didn't really put it in the deeper context, but still, even that got a lot of headlines. And the first reaction that I saw, particularly from MAGA, was to deny it. It was, oh, this is New York Times. This is just coming from some anonymous sources, or what, they did whatever they could to sort of downplay it. And to me, it's like, and I'm sure you and others, it's like, well, this is what we've been saying, and there's so much more. So that was interesting, but not surprising to see MAGA trying to just kind of deflect and say, no, this isn't, this is just mainstream garbage, or it's just left-wing propaganda. In fact, I actually talked about this in my
short
show.
Window.
Yeah, exactly. And then, it became obvious that you couldn't deny it, that this was a fact, right? So then the goalpost kind of switched, and you see, I talked about this in my show last night, like Alex Jones, InfoWars, did a whole thing trying to say, well, two things. One thing, I saw them in general trying to downplay the role that Palantir plays and just be like, well, we've all known about Palantir. I don't know why people are making a big deal. But I also saw on InfoWars, they put out an article, one of the few articles they wrote about Bilderberg this year. Obviously, Peter Thiel and Alex Karp, steering committee members of the Bilderberg group, as well as co-founders of Palantir. That conversation's pretty much been, devoid and just absent in MAGA and kind of the right-leaning so-called independent media, including InfoWars. And I've seen them, particularly Alex Jones, trying to say that the only people who are really upset about this are the left-leaning mainstream media and George Soros and the big tech companies that are mad that they're not getting the contracts that Palantir is getting. So he just tried to totally downplay, like, this is just some jealous companies and leftists. This isn't anything real to worry about.
And to point out that he made the clear point that, which is just flatly incorrect, that they were angry because they were using it just to hold the government accountable, despite the fact that it was exactly the opposite.
Oh, yeah.
The silent information was personal data, and but and even if it was, which I'm sure it's all of the data, that's not how it's being applied. It's not some guard dog, watchdog against what the government's doing. So to argue it was just the left thing, and that was probably the most embarrassing of all the kind of sidesteps, because it was just simply incorrect. And then that went away as well.
Exactly. Yeah, and then not only that, but it's just so it's such a trip to watch. Not surprising, like I said, I'm not surprised anymore by the people I see who, in my mind, are selling out principle and selling out what they claim to believe in the past. But yeah, to try to downplay it and say, well, it's not as bad as people claim, or the other thing you're saying, there's also QAnon types out there saying this is actually a trap that has been set for the deep state, and Palantir is not being used to spy on the people, but it's used to spy on the government, and they're slowly gathering up all the data they need, and then soon the tribunals and all that same old stuff. People are still trying to bring it back.
How long has that been now? We're going on like 20 years. How long has that actually been?
Crazy. And then of course there's the part of me that's like, okay, well, more people are talking about Palantir. You and I and Whitney and James and others have been talking about this for years now. And okay, it's probably a positive development that Palantir is trending, that, I was getting invited to go on Jimmy Dore's show to talk about Palantir, and some other big platforms that are finally ready to talk about it, and almost to the point of like saturation where it's like it's everywhere. And that sometimes naturally brings up skepticism. I've seen some people in the online chatter saying, we should be skeptical of why they're allowing us to talk about this now. Could it be a distraction from something else? Or is it just that Palantir is kind of being offered up and sort of sacrificed? Well, they know about Palantir, so let's just throw them out there. And then, some other company is going to become more important. Obviously, we don't know any of those things just yet. Time might, make that more clear to us. But even though we are seeing lots of people talk about Palantir where they weren't before, I still think that the company and the role they're playing is absolutely something we should be paying attention to, because the articles I wrote for TLAV before the election, including election 2024, Zionist technocrats versus Zionist technocrats, I pointed out and showed all these things and showed how there was pretty clear that Peter Thiel was going to have a major influence and Palantir would have a major influence, not only because of J.D. Vance, but because of Trump's history with Peter Thiel. And then, of course, as soon as the picks started to come in, I wrote the article, Meet the Peter Thiel Acolytes in Trump's second administration. Yeah, there's the one prior to the election that I took a lot of flack for and people wanted to ignore. And then that one, Meet the Peter Thiel Acolytes. And that was, I think I identified 8 to 10 of those. And then the one after that, Welcome to the Palantir World Order, we found up to like 15 to 20 people who were all related to Palantir. Peter Thiel, worked for his companies or worked for Palantir directly and working with Doge and all that sort of thing. So none of this is surprising. In fact, this is what's been most disappointing to me is, okay, it's being talked about in the mainstream. Great. We expect the mainstream to do a shallow job, and that's what they did. But the independent media, the alleged independent media, it's like, okay, I'm glad more people are talking about it. And thankfully, some people are ready to have the deeper discussion. But the folks like Alex Jones and others in the MAGA media are doing their best to just downplay it. So I actually did a search. I went to InfoWars yesterday and searched Bilderberg 2025, searched Peter Thiel, just kind of to see what has been the most recent reporting from Alex Jones. Again, this is a guy who used to hold protests at the Bilderberg Group and go bullhorn them, and rightfully so, and call out this stuff. And now there's literally no articles on his website that draw that connection and that distinction. I'll give them credit. They put Dan Dix's confrontation of Peter Thiel on their website, but still they had this kind of editor's note on there that I mentioned that said, Alex Jones has been calling out the surveillance state for a long time, and just did the whole downplaying. Only George Soros and Google and other companies are worried about. Just, did their best to kind of like, if anybody started to think, well, wait, isn't Peter Thiel part of the Bilderberg Group? And I thought Alex Jones was against that, just trying to sort of circumvent anybody who might question that narrative that it's not as big a deal as people are making it out to be. And so it's been disappointing that people don't want to go as deep as they should.
Yeah, I agree. I think I've seen this, and this is not unique to him or any, one group, but it's very common these days where, you'll make a lot of other suggestive points, or rather most of your coverage very clearly drives people toward a certain mindset, but then a tweet will go out about, this might be a false flag. even though everything else you've been saying points the other direction, then that gets pointed to as, I knew it, we were right, and it's like, that's a very common tactic. And it only works on people that already choose to believe in you, regardless of the outcome, precedent, what actually is being proven. And so that's what I see that as, is sort of a way to get people to think that's really what the reality, look at Dan Dix doing this. That means we're on that side, even though you've done everything else you could to downplay that, to hide that connection, to make Palantir a leftist thing that's not actually doing what it's doing. That's really important to consider.
They're
And
just trying to save face.
Yeah, I think so. Or I think it's more about trying to cement this ongoing narrative that somehow you're the one fighting these things while you're really doing the best job of cementing them, allowing people to ignore the real problem. And I think that's the biggest issue is it's the identity politics, the woke left and right. It's the culture identity stuff. It's everywhere.
And I just want to add to that just briefly. I mean, obviously it's relating to Palantir as we're discussing here, but just in the kind of broader terms of people who prior to the election, and I won't name all the names I could name, but I will name a couple names like Dave Smith, Luke Rukowski, Clint Russell over at Liberty Lockdown. There's a few other people who have sizable platforms and, claim to be libertarian or kind of beyond the left-right paradigm to some extent. They're not willing to go on every topic, but to some extent, right? But prior to the election, sure, they didn't necessarily, some of them did wholeheartedly endorse Trump and said, hey, it's going to be better than Kamala. Others sort of gritted their teeth and said, yeah, I don't like him because of this and that, but he's still the better option. And others were even more subtle where they didn't necessarily fully on endorse Trump, but they definitely did a lot of airtime dedicated to how stupid the Democrats are and how, dumb the left is. And then kind of highlighting, well, Trump seems to say the opposite, which to me is even more maybe nefarious because it's more subtle and the listener is just being shown these very still kind of binary perspective of it. Now, a lot of those folks are like, hey, well, of course, Trump's a bad guy, Iran war, this is all bad news and technocracy and all the things I know we're going to get into further today. It's like now they're ready to report on that. And I see some people saying, Derrick, get off your high horse or quit stroking your ego, because there's some level of, just to be real, like on a human level of like, yeah, I told you so, we told you so, and that doesn't give me any kind of like, oh, I'm patting myself on the back. Like, in fact, I would love to be wrong. I would love to be like sitting here and be like, dang, we were wrong, and they were right. Like, Trump is actually fighting the deep state, and maybe I misunderstood, I misread the tea leaves or whatever.
But because we want positive outcomes, Derrick. That's why we want a positive outcome. We don't want to be right. We know we'd rather be wrong and have the right thing happen than the other way around.
Exactly. So it's not even, it's like, of course, a part of me is like, all right, feels good that my analysis and, all of us, it's like, was accurate. And that's one thing. But I think in a bigger picture, it's not just about stroking our egos or anything like that. It's, for me, what matters is that, like you said, we genuinely do care about the future of humanity. I care about the principles that I hold, the principles of individual liberty. And it saddens me and angers me to watch people who are influencers or, claim to be journalists, who use the influence that they have, and then whether willingly or just ignorantly, because they don't want to listen to us, because we're just black pill, we're just negative, we're just doomers, when we were trying to say, look, both sides are being funded by the same people, don't expect different results from Trump or Harris, people didn't want to hear it. And so it's a little bit frustrating now after the fact for everybody to be jumping on the bandwagon. And now they're sort of also, I think, trying to rewrite a little bit of history and act like they were always, calling this stuff out. And they've always been about this. And I didn't endorse Trump. Yeah, but you sure spent a lot of time focused on the other side and how dumb they are, and kind of subtly making this appearance that, well, this side's all dumb and, hey, Trump did something good over here, and completely ignoring all the warning signs.
It's the same thing they call out in the left in COVID-19. Partisanship has a really difficult time with self-reflection, I've noticed, like recognizing the same fault, the same hypocrisy in themselves that they point out on the other side. I think that's part of the design, and it's a block. I mean, my biggest issue with that general discussion is people that I've talked to that I know at least, wax intellectual about the two-party illusion, right? We'll talk about and acknowledge the very clear deception, and then every day they play into it. And I don't mean just like, theorizing. I mean like playing into the illusory dynamic, the false binary, and that's what gives me the most frustration. It's like, better,
like,
man. But,
like people who are now like, well, now that we see what Trump's doing, I'm going to vote a full Democrat. That'll show the system. I'm going to go and vote on the Democrats in the midterm.
Did you take that seriously? We don't have to get into who it was unless you want to, but did you take that seriously, or did you think that was sort of like a joke? I couldn't read it. I wasn't sure which way because it felt real. And I was like,
I
that's a crazy thing to say right now.
I thought it was real. I know we're talking about the same
Mhm.
person, and we don't need to get into, because and I want to say this, like, there's some people who I do think deserve to be called out. That's why I mentioned Luke and Dave and some of these other people, and that's of course each to us, selective on our own preferences. There's other people who maybe I give a little bit of benefit of doubt, or in private conversations, I might say, yeah, so and so has maybe kind of lost their way. But this particular person is a journalist, is a somebody who is exactly what you were just describing. Is called out the left and the right, and then kind of maybe joking, but it didn't seem like a joke, saying, well, I'm going to, show them by voting straight Democrat in the midterms, and that, teach them a lesson or something like that. And to me, I'm just like, oh my God, we're going to do the same thing again in 4 years, aren't we? We're going to watch the same thing happen again. There's going to be some new populist hero that will emerge on the left or the right and promise to fix everything bad that Trump did. And it's just going to keep going back and forth. That is definitely one of the more frustrating things, whether or not that particular person was joking or being sarcastic. There are people who will think that way. There are absolute people who will think that the best, now maybe they won't go vote full on Democrat because, and even in that case, I don't know what's better. I mean, what do you think about this, man? Because some people are like, well, yeah, Trump did some bad things, but I'm still going to vote for Republicans in the next thing. And then that's obviously not very principled, or doesn't make much sense. But then to think voting for the other side full on is somehow going to, achieve your ends, like, it just, neither one of them seem to be thinking too deeply about the outcomes.
Well, this is why, Dave, like the last election product, it's more important than ever to argue, or at least hope, to give people the tools to consider why another path might be the right path. And there's many we could talk about. We've talked about many times, and that's why that's becoming more popular. And I think why the whole system is feeling desperate and vulnerable, because people are finally asking these questions. And just to put a point on it, since we went over it, we're talking about Kim Iverson, correct? That's the person we're referring to in that tweet. And I think and my gut tells me that she was kind of joking, but that's the point, is I couldn't tell. And the reason I thought it was so relevant, because I do also agree she does good work, and I don't agree with everything, but she calls out, but she,
Sure.
it's objective, like a Glenn Greenwald, who has clearly shown himself to stand with principles when it comes to the left-right paradigm, criticize everything else. We all will too. There's plenty of things to question. But what's interesting is this came out with Jimmy Dore the last time. And like I said, then even if they really mean that, or she really means it, the point is there is a level of logic to it. I disagree with it. But that, like, for example, Jimmy said at the time, out of all the arguments, this is the one that I said, okay, well, at least there's some logic to it, that he's going to vote for Republican, for Trump, because why is he going to reward the party that committed the genocide? Because Trump at that time hadn't technically been part of the genocide, right? So he is now, obviously. But so that made sense to me. Even though I disagree, I know it's a trap, I still said, okay, at least the logic is there. Everyone else, like, she's going to be worse, is just frustrating. So now I almost felt like that was her making a joke of that, right? Where now I'm just going to vote the other way.
I hope so.
Her past record, that's what I took from it. But, we should, since we talked about it enough, I felt it was important, just point that out.
Yeah, and just in case this clip makes its way to Kim, like, of course, I'm super grateful for the things you've done, for having me on your show, and I know, Ryan, you've interviewed with her as well. So I'm not trying to just shit on you, Kim, or her, or her work, or anything like that. But I do think that is a big part of the problem. And I know that when I've spoken with her and other people, and I get to the point of saying, like, look, politics isn't going to save us, and I have my own theories and ideas, and I'm not claiming those are the only way towards freedom. But I definitely feel like at this point, I'm a 40-year-old adult. I've watched this happen since I was 18. The first time I ever voted, I voted for John Kerry. The only time I ever voted, because I was anti-war against George Bush. This is 20 years ago, and it didn't take but one time of doing that to realize, like, oh my God, this is just back and forth, right? So when we see people who are clearly intelligent and clearly informed, and spend a lot of time doing this work that we do as well, it's just hard for me to see how people can keep playing in that trap. And I understand what you're saying as well, that, okay, it makes some sense and some logic within the two-party paradigm of, like, well, if this party's doing bad, I'm going to, punish them by voting for the other side. But I think that's also just the fundamental flaw, is that, like, we're still playing within their context of the predator class's game. It's like, I've said this before, they know how to handle us if we protest, if you march, if you rally, if you go out and try to be violent. They know how to handle that. They'll round you up, they'll lock you up, they'll shut you down, whatever. They know how to handle voting. They'll just rig the elections, as I think most elections are, actually selections. They'll continue to prop up puppets in front of you. But what they don't know how to handle is us removing our consent and saying, all right, well, then I'm not going to play anymore. And, I did a video about this after the election too, that once again, the largest demographic across the United States was non-voters. It was
Right.
even with, them saying this is a historic election and more people did vote maybe than previous years, but still in the broader context, that's not really much. There's still the vast majority of the country who is not voting. And that doesn't mean they're all kind of on the same page as you or I are on, but they're at least there may be some levels of apathy, or they're just dissatisfied with the choices, things like that. That does give me some hope that maybe more people could recognize that politics isn't the answer. And then, well, how do we actually, take care of ourselves? That's a whole nother conversation that we've had before. But to me, it's just like if we continue to see journalists and influencers and podcast hosts and talking heads on the internet just keep pushing their audience in that direction. I mean, this is why I've been calling for some level of accountability, not in the sense of like, let's round them all up and put them to death, or put them in, cast them out of society or something like that. But yes, I think it is important to know who was shilling for Trump and ignoring the evidence that you and I and Whitney and others could clearly see, and sending their massive audiences of hundreds of thousands or millions of people to go vote for Trump. And Ian Carroll, of course, is one of these people. Him and I have gone back and forth over that. And I told him these things would happen before the election. And here we are now. He's like, oh, Palantir, this and that. It's like, oh, come on, bro. I mean, you got this? You knew this ahead of time. And I'm not going to fault people totally for wanting to believe or wanting to have some level of hope. But we've said before on this show and on different Independent Media Alliance panels that it's actually not, it's a white pill to accept that politicians aren't going to come save you. It's not a black pill. It's not doomer to kind of step up and be an adult about the situation and say, look, we can't trust these people. I have to take care of myself. Now, how do I step into that space as an empowered person instead of being like, well, okay, they're not coming to save us, so I guess everything's screwed. That's the actual black pill. The people who bought into that like, well, if Trump's not a hero, if QAnon's a psyop, well, then we're just, and I heard this before the election. All right, Derrick, I hear what you're saying. Okay, Bilderberg Group, Palantir, Peter Thiel, but I'm still going to try with Trump, because if Trump isn't a hero and if he doesn't win, it's going to be full on communism. It's going to be full on totalitarianism. So people have put all their hope in like this one person or this one movement. Right. And if that's not true, then everything's lost. But in fact, no, nothing. Yes, we have to accept that, but that doesn't mean all is lost. It means that the power is back in your hands. And instead of outsourcing your freedom, your fight for sovereignty, you have to take personal responsibility. And I think that's scary for a lot of people too.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, self-responsibility is like the most important tenet of any, whatever you want to call it, this self, representative government or whatever we feel we exist in. It's absolutely important that we do that, because clearly they will power structures will manufacture situations, as we all acknowledge, at least in part, or the other side, or however you want to look at it. We all acknowledge it exists, to create circumstances that drive you into the places they need you to be. Now, in some part of the world, maybe they think they're doing it for the right reasons. It doesn't change the reality of what we're discussing, and that we have to start considering how that could be played out, or how they could be played without knowing it. It is self-responsibility. Exactly. But this whole system, it's like it's creating this learned helplessness where, maybe that'll be in the future, but right now it's just so bad that we have to one versus the other. It's engineered helplessnness, and it's so obvious. And I'll
get to that self-ownership later, Derrick. At some point I'll do that, but right now this is the only way to fix things. So I'll put that off for in the future. Yeah, maybe one day I'll get to that, but this is what we have to do now. And I just wanted to add to what you're saying, that I think again, I'll try to empathize with people. We got psyops on top of psyops on top of psyops here, right? And I get that it's difficult, and I'm not claiming to fully understand or know 100%. But what I have come to the conclusion, I think what you were just pointing out, and we're seeing it in so many other areas, immigration and things like this, is I believe that the predator class, they put two or more choices in front of us, and none of them are good. So just to use immigration, like people think it's like the dichotomy of the binary is like, well, here's a bad choice and the other one must be good or slightly better. But a lot of people haven't considered, what if all the choices were placed there on purpose and none of them are good for us, and none of them are actually good, but they want to make you choose one where they're going to win either way. So the immigration thing, we know that immigration has been weaponized, and for years, even before Biden, but definitely during Biden's administration, it was allowed to kind of get uncontrolled. I also think at the same time, there's a lot of right-wing propaganda that has told people Chinese agents have been sleeping in Iranian sleeper cells, and they're eating your dogs and all kinds of stuff that has later been proven to be false, but people believed it and bought into it. But yes, immigration has been weaponized. And so that grows and festers. And then the people, of course, are like, well, we got to do something. And then the options they're being presented with is elect Trump and we're going to have the largest deportation operation ever. We're going to militarize the border. We're going to ignore due process. We're going to do whatever, and labeling everybody gang members. I think we can see why that's a dangerous direction. Or do nothing and just allow this immigration policy or lack of policy to just continue to fester and, you know, see where that goes, right? So neither choice is really ideal. You don't have to be some open border, you know, radical leftist to see that, the current situation we're dealing with Trump is not a good idea. And you also don't have to be some hard right conservative to see that there is a problem with immigration, right? And so, but what's not on the table is common sense solutions like, hey, how about we end the warfare state, end the welfare state, and actually fix the immigration system so that people could get in a timely manner and you could bring in good people into the country who are just trying to live their lives and contribute, right? That's not what's on the table. It's this one extreme of do nothing and let immigration just flow endlessly forever and take ICE and they're not going to do their jobs, or empower ICE to become the Stasi and, you know, get full on, early stages of fascism. Like, that's what I mean is, like, I think that the psyops are at that point that we shouldn't assume that the choices being placed in front of us are going to benefit us either way. And I don't know what the choice is or how we approach that best, but I do think the best thing I can come up with is to not fall for the psyops, to not allow yourself to be emotionally manipulated to fall for Trump and the authoritarianism, or to the idea, which sometimes the left is like, you know, they're kind of unreasonable and they're just like, no, we just need to, you know, let everybody in and everything's fine. And they kind of have this very naive view of what that actually looks like and how that turns out. Would really neither of those choices are benefiting us.
Well, it's the way you described it. It's exactly. And I mean, I think it's obviously by design, but it doesn't have to be for those that don't want to think that people collude and conspire to control your life. But clearly it's leading to a point to where we have choices that are not in the interest of Americans in any way. And they'll admit that. It's the same thing with the last selection process where it's like, well, we all agree, but he's just better. She's worse. It's not about the good option. And so we're in a place where we're watching this and, you know, you get the screamers out there like we saw before that will act like, you know, you got to be an adult in the room. You know, you have to admit that this is the only way we can do it. And that tricks a lot of people, a lot of good intentioned people into thinking they're not smart enough to grasp the political dynamic. And so they fall into these choices, which they'll admit are not what I want. But as you said, well, the next time we'll be able to do it, you know, but by the time you get there, there's been 37 other psyops that create the same kind of hair on fire. We have to choose right now between these two things. You know, it's like that red button meme. That's everything in our life right now. It's always down to these two fake choices. But I think people I think they start to sense that right now, though. I really do. And I think that's why, to get to the next part of this, the technocratic, you know, really, that's what we seem to obviously see in all this, but just the, whatever you want to call it, the control structure that's being built is being built in my mind to make that no longer possible. Like, where our choice, their concern over what we see seems to no longer be relevant, you know? And so let's get into the whole, you know, using all of what we're talking about to drive us not so subtly into like the technocratic control structure. You'd mentioned the, the silo of information with Palantir, and that's very clear. If people haven't seen that, watch both of our work on this or read it about the, removing of the silos, using Doge and Palantir to scrape all this information, jamming it into basically one location, no concern for privacy or security. I'm convinced that Israel and their intelligence has complete access to this, and using immigration, right? That rolls over into, just including the same thing, the great Palantir reset, to what you discussed. Detachment 201, I just discussed it as well. I call it technocracy in uniform. So let's talk about that. I really think this is it's actually, I never would have predicted that that's the step that obvious to just put the CTOs of these companies, Meta, Palantir, OpenAI, into the military as lieutenant colonels, no less. So what give us your thoughts on that? What does that mean? How alarming is that?
I'm glad to see that you were covering it as well, man, because I saw somebody had shared with me the announcement, and it was interesting. I was reflecting on this the other day, actually, how many things happened that week. If you think about, the Bilderberg group was going on the same week that Trump was preparing for his military parade that Saturday. And on the day before, the Friday, is when that picture that you were showing there, when they were sworn in, the heads of these different companies. And then, of course, right after that, Israel starts bombing Iran. I tend to think that some of these decisions, maybe Detachment 201 was kind of already in the process, obviously, because they swore them in on that Friday. But I do think some of the bigger geopolitical decisions may have been made there at the Bilderberg Group. And it's also interesting, as I note in my short article there over at theconsciousresistance.com, that of course, Palantir is represented through Carp and Teal at the Bilderberg Group, but there are also officials from Microsoft and OpenAI who've been there. Yeah, man, it's just, to me, it's just that the further merging of these different institutions. We've already been talking about it with government and technocracy and things like Doge and the influence of the efficiency movement and Curtis Yarvin and all this kind of stuff. But we hadn't yet seen the military get involved. And that's what I think makes this unique is, as you said, like taking these 4 executives, giving them a lieutenant colonel position in the Army Reserve, which is typically reserved for people who are in their like 2nd decade of their career. And, and they typically do oversee several hundred to maybe even up to 1,000 soldiers. We probably won't see that with these people. Hopefully not. God, it would be even more disturbing if we end up seeing these big tech execs like actually in charge of soldiers. I mean, I don't know what that looks like. They're claiming
real quickly, I would say the logical connection would be, a new kind of battalion, or drones or technological, biosuits or something like that. AI managed, neurotechnology, to where they would be leading that special tech part of the field. That's what I'm telling you. That's like my nightmares. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're probably right. It might not be, because I mean everything's changing, right? So it might not be a typical battalion in the sense that we think of it, of just like leading soldiers. It could be that or the soldiers that they are kind of overseeing could be 100 guys sitting at computers in Las Vegas at an airbase or something like that, right? Like that we've seen with the drones and things of that sort. So it isn't, you're right, that it could come in a completely different context than what we're used to, because warfare is changing. And obviously this also, for me, goes towards 5th generation warfare, the idea that social media and the internet itself is the battlefield and the mind is the battlefield. So of course they're going to want to work closer with these big tech companies, which already have massive amounts of data on people. And they kind of term it as, this is just about modernizing the military and making it more efficient. Because I will say, and again, who knows how much of this is propaganda, but I've heard it from soldiers as well, that even the US military, for all their alleged and apparent might and power, that a lot of the military and government systems are decades behind. Which again, that could, like I said, that could be psyops in order to like convince us that we need to allow them to work with the big tech bros and further kind of dilute those apparent separations. But those of us who've been paying attention, we understand that, well, Palantir is actually born out of DARPA and the Total Information Awareness Program. Of course, DARPA is part of the US military. So there's already been this connection between the military and a lot of these big tech companies since the very beginning, since their founding, since their initial funding rounds as well with InQtel. This is just like, I think, kind of taking off the mask and completely removing, or at least a first step in the process of completely removing any sort of apparent separation from those institutions. In the same way that we know social media companies and other big tech companies started out with Facebook, et cetera, with the funding. And the more we see them working with like the Atlantic Council, or with the Atlantic Council represents NATO. So this isn't 100% new, but the fact that they're like literally swearing them in as soldiers is kind of like, wow, okay, we're at that point now. Now they're part of the military. What sort of, and that could be as well that maybe they needed to be sworn in order to be granted certain access to classified documents, or, who knows what the real purpose of this was, but I don't think it's going to be the end. I would imagine that Detachment 201, which is what they're calling, and as I point out in my little piece there, that it's somewhat reminiscent for many of us to Event 201, and they say, well, this has to do with HTTP commands. It's, not relevant. And maybe that's true. Maybe that's where they got it from, but it sure doesn't make you feel very good to see them using those numbers again.
Well, the point was, if I remember correctly, that 201, there is a reference to like the starting of some new part of the coding. So basically 201 in either context is reference to them beginning a new chapter of something. And I think that's very relevant. So that's why they would call it that, in either case. But yeah, to me, you're right. You nailed it with like the power. Like, I agree with the first part, that I think this is it's not new. It's them showing, they're stepping out of the shadows. Like, these people that are actually pulling the strings are now seizing positions of actual power, is what it feels like to me. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of contexts, whether it's Zionism influencing these, these cabinets or whatever we're talking about. We're seeing a lot of alarming power shifts that aren't being regarded as such in the mainstream alternative or mainstream media, or even like the point of like Prospera and Honduras, or these different elements we're seeing like that. I think that all of these are moves in that same direction, and giving them actual high level power in the military, it's a step too far from it. So I say it's technocracy in uniform. You're actually showing, you're proving what we're saying, like that these are the AI Silicon Valley tech experts who are now putting themselves in positions of power or vice versa in the government, in the military. You know, it's like this just needs to be acknowledged as the evidence of exactly what we're warning about. And how is that not alarming for people? How is it like Silicon Valley used to be like this? I don't know if it's ever real or not, but they had this really hard line in the sand, like we will not cross over, politics. And, and then when they started obviously being shown to be involved in drones and with Palantir and Google, all their people were protesting, going, that's not who we are. Clearly it kind of was always what they were, but now this is just revealing that same point. I mean, where do you think this goes
And
next?
it's another one. Well, and it's another one that I'm surprised that there's not more coverage of. I mean, I had somebody send it to me. And when I first saw it, I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. And then the reason I chose to actually write the article, because I wrote it a few days after the announcement, I tend to sort of like when a story breaks, I kind of wait and see. And if it's all over the place everywhere, or, like you and others, I'm like, all right, well, they've got it covered. Enough people are here, and there's no need for me to kind of, rehash that. But it was the exact opposite. I'm like, okay, so nobody else is talking about this. And I was grateful to see that you were as well. And I've seen some tweets here and there, but by and large, I haven't seen many people talking about Detachment 201, and definitely not understanding the context that we're talking about here. In terms of what happens next, I mean, I was just thinking as you were speaking there that I wonder if these lieutenant colonels, which is now the rank they have, if they have the authority in their kind of unique position to bring in more people from their crew, right? Like what sort of powers do they have underneath their belt now that they're giving this rank, like I said, is usually reserved for people who are 2 decades into their career and have proven themselves in the military. They have some level of authority. They've got soldiers underneath them, right? So could these tech execs swear in more of their employees, or could they allow, hey, now that I'm a lieutenant colonel, I have certain access to information. So maybe that means I can bring in some of my employees and my engineers into the military bases because, well, they're with me and they have clearance, or, things like that. I think there's just a lot of unforeseen outcomes that we're going to have to wait and see. But overall, to me, this is just a step in that direction. I wouldn't expect it to be the last. I'm sure we will see more tech execs follow this program, especially because they made a big deal of like, this is the first move in the Detachment 201 program, which itself is part of another broader Army transformation initiative. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of this.
What you mentioned is what I think concerns me: the potential access to high-level information, which is already there in like 100 other obvious overlaps. But maybe there are levels within the military that aren't there, and whether it's Silicon Valley and people that are showing themselves to, be true to themselves before anything else, or the influence through them. I mean, let's be obvious about who these people we're talking about. Palantir, Teal, Carp, these are like diehard Zionist supporters of Israel. And that worries me in this overlap. What are they gaining access to? And even if you don't think that's the case, well, they're just consider it being anybody else in the world. Shouldn't we be worried that there's people out there that have interests that go beyond American interests, who now have access to internal high-level information? Obviously, we saw this with Waltz using telemessage on his phone, which is an Israeli intelligence app, to archive their Signal app. Did you see that conversation? And then their phones got hacked, and it's like, well, surprise, surprise. And that's the inner circle, guys, And so before we go to go ahead.
I was just going to say, and just one other piece to kind of add to the Israel piece you're mentioning there, is that we know how many of these big tech firms also have Israeli connections because, you've got Unit 81, Unit 8200, the Mossad, obviously, the TLAV program. There's many pieces of the Israeli intelligence network that are directly tied to the tech sector and big tech sector in the U.S. So there could be some overlap as well there, right? Like, do these companies, whether knowingly or otherwise, let's just imagine the Israeli networks have infiltrated without even the permission of OpenAI or Palantir, although, like you said, Palantir has pretty openly embraced them. So I don't think they would have any qualms with giving them access. Maybe through that, they access U.S. military secrets or U.S. military technology. I mean, there's all sorts of things that I think could go wrong here.
That's what worries me the most, is where that goes. And so before we go back to Israel and maybe, finish and talking about some foreign policy, there's an obvious point to go on this that connects to the overlap of all we've been discussing that you commented on recently. And this is, and we can obviously go into a lot of different things here. The contradiction of the the leadership in the Maha movement, not necessarily everybody who believed that's where it was going, because I still think they're largely and their intentions were good. They got played by people like this who are rolling out CRISPR pig meat, mRNA shots, MMR shots, I mean, self-amplifying shots, or, you know, any number of other things, allowing the PFAS restrictions to be removed. I mean, I'm shocked to see how brazen the 180 was in a lot of this. But so you recently commented on the wearables, this conversation, and then the Secretary Kennedy put this out. Wearables put it, basically what he says is by the end of the year that, or a couple years, he thinks that everyone should have a wearable. And so you just said it was a bad move and listed the obvious. So what are your thoughts on that? And, you know, all that, wherever you want to go with it.
So if you click that link, there's the conscious resistance. That's a report I did, which is actually based on an article I wrote for TLAV. And funny thing about this, so that's just my video version of the article. The articles in the show notes that we did a while back about this whole wearable thing. Yeah, right there, that article. The U.S. government awards contracts to 7 organizations with ties to Gates Foundation, DARPA, and big tech. And I was just showing how in there that a lot of those companies focus on wearable technologies and things of that sort, and kind of showing, this is October 2020, so we're in the middle of COVID, and it wasn't necessarily a prediction, but all the signs are there. And here we are 5 years later, and the new head of the HHS, who's supposed to be Maha, is here saying that that's going to be the future. And in the next couple of years, I think he said 3 or 4 years, that everybody would be wearing them. Thankfully, there has been a lot of pushback, and people are, you know, it's not like Maha is taking this laying down, although I think a lot of people are disappointed for sure. And I do think, I agree with your analysis there, that while I have been pretty critical of Kennedy, and I will continue to be, I do think there's a lot of well-meaning, intentioned people who jumped on board with that movement and absolutely did follow Trump simply based on the Maha promises, which I think was part of the PSYOP as well, whether Kennedy was fully aware or not. That was part of, because we know that Trump, he needed the libertarians, he needed the crypto crowd, just as far as for whatever you think the elections are real. Even if we know the elections are rigged and Trump was totally selected, which is what I tend to believe, there still needs to be the appearance of unity. There needs to be the appearance of momentum of a movement, right? Because if there was no movement, and all of a sudden this happened, there would be a lot more skeptical people. But now people are like, what are you talking about, Derrick? We built a movement, a coalition. We had Tulsi, we had RFK, we had all these disaffected Democrats, and we had the crypto bros, and we had the libertarians, and we came together in this beautiful coalition, and that's how we won. So it gives this air of legitimacy. But the point is that a lot of people did vote for Trump and went, you know, have joined this kind of movement skeptically, you know, very uncertain, but they did so because they believe, well, at least maybe we can get some movement around the health aspect. And to be certain, I mean, yeah, I get like they felt like there was a gamble, and people tell me, Derrick, well, there's no chance of this happening with Kamala Harris, so I'm going to go with Trump. And yeah, I think it's the ACIP, the vaccine committee, that a lot of the mainstreams make it a big deal about right now, that RFK and his team, they removed all the old people and they put in new folks like Robert Malone. I am also skeptical of Robert Malone and some of his connections and his discussion of the CIA. But even putting that aside, I can objectively say that's probably better. They're probably going to do better than the previous guys would do. But we shouldn't ignore then that Trump's FDA has approved to fast track 2 mRNA injections already. And you mentioned the Stargate mRNA AI stuff, the HHS under RFK declaring anti-Semitism, you know, one of the greatest public health threats. And there's also still the other, we haven't talked about this in a while, but the other one that I'm still keeping an eye on, and I did write one article for TLAV maybe a month ago, but there's been more updates, is that the Trump administration is still showing all signs that they are going to fight the ruling of the fluoride lawsuit. I published this a couple weeks ago. They did their 3rd request. So, you know, for those who have missed it, last year, federal judge rules that the EPA is supposed to act, either ban fluoride or do something. And that was under the Biden administration, of course. And right before Biden left, his EPA did issue an appeal. And so then it was like, okay, let's kind of wait and see. Is Trump going to continue the appeal? A lot of Maha people, including my friends over at the Fluoride Action Network and people who are involved in that lawsuit, are like, no, he's going to come in. They're going to shut the appeal down, and we're going to see what the EPA does. Well, it's about to be July, and they're still fighting that appeal. And that gentleman you're showing on screen there, he is the Surgeon General now, and he's also a lawyer who defended Trump during some of the impeachment hearings in the past. And his attorneys have now requested and received 3 different extensions. So they were supposed to make a decision if they were going to appeal back in like March or April, and then they delayed it to April, and then they delayed it till May. and then they delayed it to June. The most recent one I saw was an extension to like July 11th.
When we discussed this on the interview, that was at the point where they had delayed it once. Is that correct?
They had delayed it twice then, and now there's been a third one since then. So I think in that article there, I think in that article I posted that their next deadline was June 11th, but right before June 11th came up, they extended again. So I think it's like July 5th or something. I'll have to look up the exact date, but I've been following the court records because again, the corporate media is not following this. So you just got to log in and you got to follow the court records, and you can see, and I quoted them from there. It seems pretty clear that the Trump administration is going to continue to fight it, because what they've said several times now is that we need more time to review the scientific data before the Surgeon General can decide if he's going to go through with it. You know, basically they're saying like, we make a report, we pass that to the Assistant Surgeon General, he reviews it, he makes some recommendations, and then that goes to the Surgeon General, and he's the one who makes the actual final call. But in my mind, and this is what Michael Connett, who's the lead attorney, who's told me, and I think it's quoted in that article, that we've already had numerous reviews. We don't need the EPA to do more reviews on top of reviews and have this thing delay for another 5-10 years, and then it never happens. The Trump administration. Exactly. And if the Trump administration wants to follow the federal government's own report of the National Toxicology Program, or follow the ruling of a federal judge, then, and follow MAHA, because RFK surely knows there's problems with fluoride, then there should be no question. It should just be, we're rescinding the appeal. The EPA is going to act, and that's a done deal. Instead, they're delaying and saying, we're going to let you know, we'll figure it out soon. And there's been no major reporting on this. And I think they might be hoping that people just kind of forget about it, and the whole thing goes away.
So frustrating. Yeah. So they delayed it again since we talked. I mean, yeah. And the fact that the evidence was already, they've gone through this all the times you've already been covering it, the many different times they've tried to roll it back and the evidence was already there. You know, we can hope, as always, we should hope, as I get where they're coming from, that this is going to go the right direction. But the moment that this doesn't, we're going to be screaming about it. Right. And it's everyone needs to call it out, because this is a major, I mean, this is about the same level for me as the MMR shot, which was insane to see RFK Jr. go the way he did with that. So, you know, fluoride being something he's been adamant about over the years. And so we'll have to see when it happens, but Derrick will be covering when it happens. So look forward to that. Yeah, it's frustrating, man. I mean, it's just, there's so much of this stuff. And this is why, again, the point of the community, there's a lot of them. Like I'll point out Mary Talley Bowden, for example, MD, who she's been very aggressive about this, rightly so, you know, going like, it's about principles and this is wrong. The moment they went away from it, she's like, that's not what we promised. That's wrong. And that's what it takes today. We have to start standing by our principles, or we're going to get lost.
I do appreciate her and others that have a bigger platform that are calling out. And that's one good thing I will say about this sort of the social media aspect of this, is that when RFK makes these tweets, look at the comments. I mean, he's getting ate up by his own people, people who are like, you sold out. This is not what I voted for. Now, obviously, that who knows if that translates into anything, but at the very least, it's good to see that not everybody following Trump or following RFK are sycophants, and that some people are choosing to stick with principles over, you know, personalities.
I get the sense that it's a lot more than we think, and that there's a lot of people in the middle of all this who don't have a voice, who don't have a large following, who don't, you know, in the sense of like being seen in the conversation out there, who just are very unhappy with what's going on, you know, but they're not out there waving their hands going, we should have picked Kamala. They still think, you know, in their minds, there still was only two choices, but they're not happy with this. And I'm talking to more of them every single day. They just don't, you know, they get drowned out by the Nick Sorders and Jones of the world, who just scream the narrative over the top of everybody. And, you know, and then it gives them some feeling like, okay, maybe I'm wrong. You know, maybe we're still winning, you know, and they fall back in line, you know. So, but I think that people recognize how, you know, this is not going the direction that they had wanted, you know. And so let's finish with a conversation of some foreign policy, because obviously this is a very, very large conversation going on. So first, excuse me, before we talk about Iran and some different points, speaking of manipulators, here's what Nick Sorter put out around Gaza, which I just think says a lot. And we've seen this so many times. He says, breaking, President Trump, which again, wasn't breaking. He saw somebody else report it and then reported it. It says Donald Trump has convinced Bibi, they all love to call him Bibi now because Trump said that, to end the war in Gaza within 2 weeks, per multiple reports. So point is, a report went out saying something we've heard 1,000 times and never actually happened, right? Then he goes, the peace president never stops. I'm like, you know, you can't, being a cheerleader today is so self-evident. You know, we don't even know what's happening yet, but it says they've agreed that UAE, Egypt, and 2 other countries will govern Gaza. Oh, okay. So we're now at the point again where Palestinians don't decide their own future. So they'll say no, and they'll be blamed for not wanting peace. You know, it's like the same old cycle, man. But just want to point out, And if you want any comments on Gaza, since it seems to be kind of the back burner of the conversation right now in foreign policy, it frustrates me. We're still playing this game where the fake ceasefire, so we can get a moment of some kind of fake win, like when he came into power and they pretended there was a ceasefire that we all knew they were going to break, you know,
Absolutely.
and the idea that they're not making their own choices. Go ahead.
That's what's been coming to my mind too, because I've had some Trumpers in my comments when I made like a big post, several posts the last week about the bombing of Iran and just sort of, hey, here's your peace president, right? And now it's funny, even Nick there, who I cannot stand that dude, is kind of twisting it. It's like when we say he's not a peace president, it's because he's bombing people and he's doing without congressional approval, and because he dropped more drone bombs than Obama, and you know he helped Saudi Arabia massacre Yemen. We could go on and on, right? He's funding Gaza, etc. The massacre of Gaza. But then they're twisting it of peace president because he's going to allegedly broker a peace deal, even if in the process of getting this alleged peace deal, it means him launching wars and bombs and killing people, or at least supporting that. I think that's part of the manipulation.
Or the fact that he's you know, let's just assume for sake of conversation, he's actually seeking peace, which I don't believe. And I think the facts back that up. But even if he is, you're seeking peace for something you started. You can't be called a peace president for brokering a peace in a war that you initiated, or rather with your allies that you back. I mean, but they know that though. I mean, I should give them the credit when it comes to intelligence, but I think that largely they're aware they're being deceptive, in my opinion.
I think so. And then the other point I would make is what the second part of his comment was alluding to, which you pointed out, is that, okay, so this alleged peace deal does not involve Palestinians having a voice. This involves other nations like the U.S. And this is, to me, just one of the fundamental problems with this is like, people say, well, Iran shouldn't have access to nukes. And it's like, well, why is it the U.S. that gets to decide that? Why is it that nations like Israel and the U.S. who have weapons of mass destruction are the ones that get to decide who else gets to have those weapons of mass destruction? And I guess that's the answer as well, because they've got the weapons and they could decide who gets to keep them. And if not, they're going to use them on people. But it's just that sort of unspoken assumption that, well, the U.S. government is the good guys, the U.S. military is the good guys. And so we're the ones who get to decide who gets to have what on the world stage. But then also so the UAE, which is not known for human rights, caring about human rights, Egypt, same problems, and other Arab states are going to govern Gaza, not the Palestinian people, not a two-state solution, not the Palestinians themselves, nothing of that. It's just, we're going to get some other foreign governments to come in there. And I bet you those foreign governments would like to have a piece of that, that real estate that we all know that they're after, and that Jared Kushner and others would love to have. And even Trump shared, those freaking AI generated videos of him and Netanyahu hanging out on the beach and stuff like that. Right. So it's really demoralizing and frustrating to me, man, because this is, in my view, in my perspective, all of this and the battle that the Palestinian people have been fighting for generations now is just another legacy of colonization. And, colonization obviously has impacted the entire world, but this is like one of the places in the world where it's still ongoing, where there's a people who are being colonized by people from around the world just because they happen to be Jews. And that's not to say that the people I have friends who were born and raised in Israel and they didn't start this conflict. They're not to blame for it necessarily. But I do think there's something that people need to come to atone for, is that the land you are living on, though, did belong to somebody else. And even if it's not your fault and you were born into this, and, I'm not saying you need to be exterminated, or I'm not even necessarily saying you need to be taken out of your home, but at the very least, these people should be allowed to exist where they have been, where their ancestors have been, and where, they were born into, instead of being removed. And it shouldn't be this sort of paternal, which is unfortunately the way that government works, this sort of paternal system that says, well, we're going to, from on high, kind of dictate what these people should do because we know what's better for them. When really it just comes down to that the world is beholden by the Zionist regime. Most of the Western nations are, as this audience knows very well, and they will not allow a situation where Israel does not have the upper hand. And that's what it all comes down to.
Right. And I would argue each one of those countries they're pointing to would, in their own way, allow Israel to rule Gaza through them, if not blatantly over the top of all of them, which is probably what's really going to happen. So it's just it's infuriating.
Exactly. They're all just puppets of Israel in their own way.
Yeah, I agree. And what's frustrating is that this, the sentiment being pushed out about them being decided, or, every single element of this, not to get into it today, because, we're just touching on this. all of it are based on lies, from the occupation itself to the the illusion of what's really going on, the election of Hamas, the funding of Hamas, and it's just so frustrating. We still have to play games with people that are being willfully dishonest or have no idea what they're talking about in the context of all of this. The world is aware of what Israel is, and to your point, that's not all Jews or all anything other than the people in the Zionist government committing these crimes, and that's what, and through that, who they manipulate. And the world sees this, like that their claims have no power anymore in regard to Zionists lying about racism and so on. It has fallen apart, and that's why it's so important that we keep pushing on this story, because there's people that have pointed this early on and said that this, and I made a similar point about how long we would talk about what this is. And I believe it's going to go on for centuries at the very least. It's a very huge moment for what this, if assuming it goes in the right direction, where the world will be different forever, because we'll finally get to see what they've been doing in so many ways around the world. And that's going to have a major changing point. It's a very important time for us to stick to our principles, to put a point on it. I really think so.
Absolutely.
But let's talk about the Iran overlap to that, since you were already pointing to that as well, because right now, obviously, Israel is now, what is it, 6 different fronts currently involved with, bombing multiple countries, 5 at the very least. This is what Donald Trump put out. Well, this overlaps with his going into the Iran part we'll finish with, but this is actually a real post. Candace Owen shared this. She said, I legitimately had to cross-check Truth Social to see if this was real, and it's real. For anyone who would like to take a deeper look into Bibi Netanyahu, check out the Bibi files, which, if you haven't, my God, it'll blow your mind. It's everything we've already talked about, but this guy is hated.
Is that a documentary? Or
yeah,
is it
it's worth your time, man.
I think I've downloaded that a while back when that came out. Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild. For one thing that jumps to my head, Miriam Adelson, for all her power and the family and the money behind them, is on leaked video saying, if I say the wrong things, that he'll kill her, that they'll kill me, and with no humor. Wow. And there's so many different points, and all these people like lying and trying to cover up, and nobody likes him. Everybody and even right now they're trying to get him removed, and Trump's now trying to defend him, saying it's terrible what's happening to him. So here's the same kind of sentiment. And he says, I was shocked to hear that the state of Israel.
By the way, we can't see your screen right now.
Oh, thank you. Either way, it's just a post from Truth Social. It says, I was shocked to hear, and here, just so you can see it, this is what Candace Owens was saying first. I was shocked to hear that the state of Israel, which has just had one of its greatest moments in history. I'm not even sure what what does he mean? The bombing of Iran? And it says, and is strongly led by Netanyahu, is continuing its ridiculous witch hunt. Like against Netanyahu. All the evidence they have, multiple indictments, all the different people, and indictments aren't proof, but the evidence is unreal. And all the different times, the only reason he's not in prison is because he started all these different wars. Even Haaretz will tell you that. And just goes on to basically say, where he says, Bibi and I just went through hell together, fighting a very tough, brilliant, longtime enemy of Israel, Iran, by what? Bombing them a few times? He's so bombastic and hyperbolic. Stronger in his love for the incredible Holy Land. You get the point of it. I don't have to read it all, but that's calling from the part in him. It's just, I agree. It's insane for him to come out and say it's now. So when he first, actually, just on that one tweet, what's your take on that? Does that suggest to you that he's compromised, or that he just is that far supporting them? How do you say this with what he knows his base thinks about this guy?
I just think Trump is full of shit. There's just no other way to put it. I saw that same post from Truth Social going around and some of the reporting on it. And yeah, I had the same reaction. Like, what universe is this guy living in? Like, even like you said, his own base isn't fans of Netanyahu, and they're having to twist themselves into, knots and use mental gymnastics to kind of make it make sense for them. And here he is openly, embracing him and claiming that he is this great hero. And you also rightfully pointed out that prior to October 2023, and this whole thing, this latest, of course, Israel's been massacring the Palestinians for generations now, but the October 2023, Netanyahu was already slated for impeachment, and things were rising up, investigations against him. And being a wartime president, as Trump has said there, has allowed him to extend his power and kind of delay that inevitable. And now that it's happening, of course, Trump's coming to his aid and defending him. It's not surprising to me, but it does just show, I think, how I've never truly understood the Trump fascination, the Trump deception. I've legitimately tried to and listen to some of Trump's talks and to see what is it that people are getting. And I think that for me, it plays on the lowest base human emotions. Like you said, he's bombastic. He likes to make fun of people. Look at those stupid, fake news, and everybody cheers and laughs. Or
Mhm.
Or the other thing, he tugs their heartstrings and like, here's this mother whose child was killed by an immigrant. I'm going to stand and fight for them. The other big thing is, of course, his statements. He said multiple times that they're not coming after me, they're coming after you, and I'm standing in the
Right.
way. There's a lot of psychological stuff going on here that I think pulls people in so that they identify with Trump and really kind of have this almost unbreakable bond. Thankfully, it is breakable, and some people do wake up from it, as I've heard over recent weeks. People saying, "Yeah, I voted for him, but I'm regretting it," this and that. But yeah, I just think that Trump doesn't have much. He's not a deep philosophical thinker. He's not a eloquent speaker. He doesn't have much to offer other than bombastic, lies and playing on people's emotions. And the fact that anybody can see that and buy into it. Of course, you got the Laura Loomers of the world and people who follow her who will love and cheer that on. But I don't think they're the majority of MAGA. I don't think that the majority of MAGA does want this relationship with Netanyahu. But the problem is, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier in the conversation, is some people are still stuck on personalities and they don't know how to kind of pull that apart and allow space in their mind of, okay, maybe I did vote for Trump. I do think he's better than Kamala, but still, this doesn't line up with what I am fighting for. This doesn't line up with what I voted for. This doesn't line up with what I believe. In fact, it goes against it. It doesn't not only not align, but it goes right against the very principles I believe in. And you see this also with like him, attacking Thomas Massie. I don't agree with Thomas Massie on maybe everything in the world, and I know there's some people who have concerns about some of his connections.
Yeah,
But
right,
as far as politics go, he is the most principled person in the political game. Like, let's just say that, right?
Yeah.
And easily. And for Trump to have such a fit and want to go after him because he's not towing the line, and some of his base are buying it and they're ready to primary him and try to get him out of office. They tried that and they didn't succeed, which I think is funny too, to watch them fail at that.
Yeah.
But either way, the point is, like, somebody who was supportive of Trump and, bought into the narrative because, okay, well, he's going to do some of these good things, Doge, etc., is now saying, hey, look, he's going to war without authorization. The stupid bill, I'm not even going to call it what he calls it, the stupid big bill is, going to add all this money to the deficit. And Massey is just speaking truth about it, and Trump can't handle it. This just shows me too that even though people want to ignore it because they think it's just leftist TDS, Trump has an authoritarian streak, and he demands obedience to him. That's the sign of an authoritarian. So it's not just leftist mainstream media, George Soros talking points to acknowledge that. You can see all of the personality traits in Trump, that he demands allegiance and obedience, and the people who don't give it, he's ready to toss them under the bus.
I mean, and let's be clear, that's actually an acknowledged point within a lot of the team sport politics hierarchy and all, like, that you don't counter signal the leader. Like, I've seen these statements out there. Or even Mary Tal, we just mentioned Bowden. She says she got all these people in her DM saying, just tone down. Don't say those things right now. Don't say it because you're hurt. It's like, it's the truth though. And it's the truth. And you're asking me to,
you're going to hurt the movement.
Yeah, man, it's very, very clear in all of this. And, like I said, it is Trump first, not America first for a lot of these people. And some of them, like a cat turd out there, will be honest about that and say, I will always trust Trump and I'll always side with Trump. It's like, you're basically saying what we all laugh about, it's very clear.
You're proving our point.
Exactly. But so to finish on the Iran overlap to all of it, this is a tweet from Aaron Mate. I don't know if you saw this. Well, I want to talk about a few things to just wrap up in general. Your thoughts about where we are with Iran and the back and forth. We don't have to go into all of it, but just whatever strikes your mind right now is interesting. In the bombing of the base in Qatar, the possibility that people were warned and they were removed. We have the sleeper cell point that I will make a point on before we wrap that I think is very interesting. Aaron said this. If we saw this Washington Post thing. Now, he says, not that we need any more confirmation, but the Washington Post reports that the Israeli-U.S. attack on Iran was decided months earlier. And we've already reported this. Now, we're not taking this based on what Washington Post has to say. The facts they're pointing to have been confirmed in multiple ways and saying that decided months earlier that they had nothing to do with nuclear weapons, that they had already decided. Even, I think it was it Rubio admitted that essentially after March 7th was when they had already made the decision. And it says senior Israeli officials say they already decided by March, that was the one I was referencing, to attack Iran the same month the U.S. intel community assessed that Iran had no nuclear weapons program. We didn't touch on that either. The Gabbard, basically saying the truth, IAEA saying the truth, Trump saying he doesn't care, and then her just lying about what she said. It's very weird. The reason, it goes on to say, was that Iran would have rebuilt its air defenses by the latter half of the year. Exactly, which gave Israel a unique opportunity to execute plans, carefully laid plans, and years in advance to heavily damage a weakened Iran. That's what they wrote. Just to underscore the point, the choice to attack was not so much driven by new intelligence indicating an Iranian sprint for a nuclear weapon or any imminent threat to Israel. Direct quote from the article. So very, very telling, but not news to you and I would imagine. But what are your thoughts?
No, it's definitely not news, and yeah, there's a couple of points you brought up there that I'll comment on. I mean, for one, I hadn't seen that specific Post article, but this is something that others have suspected. I've seen some reporting elsewhere that for one, like you said, Gabbard, like totally flip-flopping. She shared the video where the video literally says the opposite of what she says, and it's just, I think these people think that MAGA is stupid, or that a lot of people are blind, or they're still realizing that we have the internet and we can, pull up clips and stuff like that.
Just desperate. It could be just
desperation.
They're
just desperate, yeah. And I think also, though, again, I'm gonna hammer the point home again. These people have no principles. If they did have them, they're willing to sell them out when it comes to Trump. And you also made a great point a couple of moments ago about, you see this often in the political world, which is the reason why I think it's kind of inherently set up to make people abandon principles, because once you get in there and maybe you think you're going to do something good, but then you're not supposed to do what Thomas Massey is doing or others are doing. You're supposed to always, like, maybe privately you say, hey, I think I have a problem with this, but publicly you're always supposed to praise the dear leader and say he's right. We're stand together with the party. And it's not about being, doing what's right. It's not about doing what you believe in. It's not about your principles. It's just about maintaining a united front. We must look like we're all on the same page for the sake of appearance or whatever. And I think that's just completely garbage. Like, if people actually had principles, as Thomas Massey appears to, at least in this case, then stand on them. And I said the same thing when they put RFK in there, and I was just telling people how that they're failing on a lot of fronts, and people are like, well, Derrick, if they come out too strong, it's going to do this and they're not going to succeed. And I just feel like if you have your principles and if you got the truth on your side, stand on that, right? And if Tulsi Gabbard was who she claims to be, this anti-war cool surfer chick who's just one of the one of the cool people on our team, then stand on that and stand proudly and say, look, I voted for Trump. I'm happy to be a part of this cabinet. I love my position, but they're wrong on this. And I don't want to go down in history as being wrong. So I'm going to stand firm on this. And maybe you get kicked out. Maybe they fire you. And at least the people see that you stood on that. But that's not what a lot of these people are capable of doing, because they have political aspirations. We have to remember that Tulsi Gabbard also ran for president a couple times. Right. For her, this could be a leg up to be the next candidate, right? I mean, that's typically how these people operate, is they want their positions and they want to show that they held that position long and they did some great things. And now they have the experience to be the commander in chief, right? So there's that kind of angle. And then in terms of the whole sleeper cells stuff, man, I know you have something else to add to that, but I'll just say my initial thoughts, of course, were like, be prepared for a false flag, be prepared for something going on. I was reminded of that really telling and interesting 60 Minutes report. I'm sure you saw it. It was during the Lebanon pagers thing happened, when they interviewed this like masked Israeli Mossad agent or whatever. And he said something to the effect of like, we create the reality you guys are living in, right? And just how much the Israeli intelligence is doing that, is doing reality fabrication and psyops around us. And more specifically, that they have the technology to blow up pagers in the way that happened. We don't have time to get into it today, but for those who never really followed that story, it wasn't just that they like randomly hacked the pagers. Like, they had to track down, okay, which company and manufacturers are making the pagers that the Hezbollah is going to use. And then they infected the assembly line and the manufacturing, so then they could track them. And they were tracking them for months, just waiting for the right time to blow them up. So they could do the same thing in the US if they wanted to. They could do some false flag. They could have, Israeli sleeper cells go out and do something. And of course, there's always the possibility that they just stage a cyber attack and then blame it on Iran. They've already seen this. And we saw this after the fact with the alleged assassination attempt in Butler, where they started trying to say that it was somehow related to Iran. And that didn't really catch on. I did some reporting too. I was reviewing it recently. Right before the election, there was like this, intelligence out there that Iran may try to hack the US election. And they never really made anything of it, but it was like they're already seeding people's minds with that idea. And so when you put that into full context, they have this whole record. They can now look back and be like, well, we know Iran was involved in the assassination. We know they tried to hack the election, and kind of build up this narrative that they've been trying to get into us. And now this is just the latest response. And it's in response to our beautiful bombing of that country that we all know is part of the axis of evil that George Bush told us about after 9/11. It's like this long game. One other point on that, I reported this on my show last night that I found really, really odd. I don't know, interesting that General Wesley Clark, who you know and both of our audiences know, was the man who said about the going into 7 nations in 5 years at post 9/11, including, he said, ending with Iran. Well, now he's on MSNBC sharing this sleeper cells propaganda, which I thought was just really interesting. It's like, this is the guy warning us about the plan, which we've all seen play out with them going to Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, bombing in Somalia, bombing these other countries, Yemen, getting control of that through Saudi Arabia, and then now going after Iran. And now here he is on MSNBC spreading propaganda about sleeper cells. And maybe he knows something we don't. And maybe that is a real threat and we're just kind of being naive here. But I find it very suspicious that it's like the same guy who told us about this plan is now out there saying that we need to be careful because Iranian sleeper cells are hiding in our bushes.
Right. Well, I doubt either of us would ever doubt the possibility or ever, blindly disregard that it could be happening. Like, what we want are facts, not insinuations from intelligence that lies more often than not, So, but the idea that there's any kind of a sleeper cell from any government is obviously something that could exist. But whether, Israelis are doing that, in your point about the pager attack, there's more evidence to that effect than anything I've ever seen in my life. And the idea of whether, tacking or deploying things that sit there for years, as they would argue, and then executing that, killing, I think it was hurting 75% of it was women and children. It's horrific stuff. But the possibility, or as you said, they said the world is our stage or something like that. And you said that what you said, the second part, where they're admitting to.
Yeah, they say we're creating reality for you and you're just existing in it or something.
The paraphrasing. So they're basically saying, that we dictate anywhere, or the different times the Knesset and people in, as their Congress, for those that don't know the term, for in Israel, openly say that we can legislate anywhere in the world. And international law does not bind us. And that's very real. Many times that's been stated. All these things in the context show you that that's very possible. Back to the point about the Iran dynamic. We shouldn't disregard whether Iran could do that. But the question is, to what end? That isn't, if there is no provable end or intention, that still doesn't mean it's not possible. But ask why that would make sense. Okay. So then, if it's happening, right? So we have people in this country, then we should start looking for facts. Because what's interesting to me is, at the time, I've never seen more of an interest from Israel and the United States to get you thinking something like that's happening, that we start seeing all the DC Dranos and sorters and all the rest just floating out fact-free nonsense about sleeper cells. Holman putting out things about sleeper, not facts, just going, Biden let people in, so Iran sleeper cells. Like that being the basic argument.
Exactly. And that fits right into the two-party narrative of like, well, it's Biden's fault because of his stupid border policy. He let in these Iranian sleeper cells, and then that plays right into the current propaganda.
Right. So again, question all of this. Be ready. Be worried. Consider, but don't jump into any reactionary situation. With there's plenty of false flag dynamics. I'll just include this that I thought was it. This is what I was going to just point to. I think this is just interesting. Certainly could just be the inadequacy of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. I don't know, but here's the post. It says, ICE arrest 11 Iranian illegal aliens over the weekend, including alleged Iranian army sniper Karimi. He was carrying an Islamic Republic of Army ID. And I simply said, because it's customary for the sleeper cell operatives to carry Iranian military identification. I just thought that was a little bit interesting, right? But my point
feels like 9/11 in the passports.
Yes, right. A little bit too convenient, but no, certainly possible. My point, though, is that if you really look at the story, there's only 2 of them that they argue have any real potential concern, but not enough for them to even be like, other than maybe the current political overview of the immigration thing, like these people wouldn't be able to necessarily be declined entry to the country. The point is that if you look at all of them, it very well could just be Iranians who are here, who are immigrants, who are now being arrested. Now, I don't know. My point is, I don't have any other evidence other than insinuations from people who have been caught lying 100 times just since they've been put in position, So it's very interesting.
And who have an incentive to lie and push their propaganda.
Absolutely.
They have an incentive to keep people afraid. And just one last point I'll make on that is, and maybe this is an example of it with this catching of these 11 men here, but where's Palantir? Where's Clearview AI? You're telling me this massive surveillance state we have can't locate these alleged sleeper cells that are just hiding everywhere.
Right. Or if they can't, that's more of their reason to justify why they need to look closer and scan more. And, it's all this self-fulfilling prophecy. But yeah, the point is just to keep, be quiet, skeptical to sow discernment. I'll include this at the end as well. This just adds more to my very clear concern. Those that watch this show, you already know about this. This, for Derrick, you might not have seen this. Many large 100,000 follower Patriot MAGA accounts came out with this. Iranian national was let into the country under Biden. It says, soon you will know who I am. Remember the story? It's this guy. He did come in. He did say that. Now, the video they don't include is where he says he's Palestinian. That's why they cut it out. But he wasn't Palestinian either. This came out at the time when they were trying to convince you that Palestinian Hamas were going to sneak into the border, right? Well, we covered this in January 2024 when the same grifters told you he was Palestinian. He's proven to be he worked for Mossad. He was arrested by Egypt, charged him as working for Mossad. And here's the actual article. So I have to go through it all again. You guys can check it out. But what's funny is I covered this at the time. The guy who they want you to, the guy in the border, this guy, they wanted you to think it was this guy. That's the one they claimed it was. This guy, at the time this guy was crossing the border, is like 30 years older. And he has a channel, and you can prove it. And so they are trying to make him into be this Islamic terrorist. The reality is you can prove, based on many different factors I did in the show, that he's actually the guy that got accused of working for Mossad, was arrested, and somehow ended up on our border claiming he was a Palestinian when that was the interest. And now suddenly it's being claimed to be an Iranian. You know what I mean? And it's like, so these things just scream that we're being manipulated into a certain situation, but wow. Still consider everything else, but check out the show for those who don't know. The evidence is very clear. It's striking. But so, end with where you think this might go, brother. Any of the comments you were going to make there?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say thanks for all the work you put in, man, because I think that those, even though those are like small little details sometimes and they get lost in the sauce of so many other things happening, I try to hold on to those types of stories because those are the kind of things that little detail, right, as you showed there with Patriot, whoever sharing it, gets shared millions of times and repeated, and then that gets picked up and shown in other videos and then TikTok videos, and then people carry that knowledge and they think, oh, wait, I remember that one time this Iranian blah, blah, whatever. And even just being able to catch those lies, whether it was intentional or it just, people in a hysteria rush to, prove their point, having those little examples to pull up are so important because it can help debunk other things where we can show people, look, no, that actually wasn't what they told you that it was. And so then that should call into question the entire narrative that you've bought into. So thanks for, just the tireless work that you do trying to keep up with these daily breakdowns. Yeah, I just want to encourage everybody, as I have been doing, that ultimately, like, don't fall into the fear propaganda. World War III, maybe it's going to happen. Maybe it's not. I put a poll up the other day on social media asking people's thoughts, like, how many of you actually believe that the Western bloc of Israel, US, UK, 12 Eyes nations, Five Eyes, etc., and the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, North Korea, how many people truly believe that they do not get along? And some people seem to believe it's all a charade and there's, no disagreements and they're hanging out, sipping champagne behind the scenes. I think that there's some version of that. I think these people tend to have ideological and cultural differences that do exist and sometimes might create real world conflict. But I always try to remind people too that at the end of the day, 99 times out of 100, the predator class are going to work with each other. They're going to agree with each other. And I stand with the Israeli people who are just fighting for freedom, and the Palestinian people, of course, not the people who bought into propaganda and want the Palestinians dead, or the people who are vice versa, the American people, the Iranian people who are just trying to live their lives. I don't stand with or support the Iranian government or the Israeli government or the US government, and on and on and on. And I think that is the worst part, is that when these conflicts happen, even just this bombing back and forth for 12 days or whatever, they're calling it now the 12-day war. The ceasefire obviously hasn't held. Real people are dying. Like, real people are dying, and innocent people are being caught up in the mix. And that is what I try to remember and hold on to, is like, we should remain skeptical. We should continue to try to decipher things. And yes, it's probably a good idea to have some food stored away or to kind of have a plan for whatever good it might do, for hard times ahead. But don't buy into the propaganda, and remember that the system and these people who run it, they want us hating the other, whether that's the Israelis or the Jews or the Iranians or whatever. And at the same time, sure, there are some Iranians that chant death to America. You don't have to embrace that to understand they have good reason to feel that way. American policy for the last 70 years in their countries, intervening in the Middle East, military intervention, false flags, all that stuff does is breed new terrorists. It breeds new people who rightfully or wrongfully feel like they want to get vengeance for what happened to their families and to their children. And that's a big part of the problem. The US war machine is creating this feedback loop of people who want to respond and want to react. And then what do? We call them terrorists. And then we want to send more bombs and more soldiers and things like that. And so just remember that there are real humans involved in this, and we should do our best not to get lost in the war propaganda, because it's ramping back up like post 9/11 again.
Well, here, man. Great point to end on. And I think it's, here to the first part about calling it out, and definitely agree that is, at least the propaganda is ramping up. And, I think that we've been in a state of multi-nation war for a long time, whatever you want to call that. But what we're worried about is the collective kind of shove into both the propagandized acknowledgement of whatever you want to call World War III, because that will signify some kind of new direction, but also just the ongoing war crimes that are committed every moment we're talking right now by the people who are acting like they're trying to push peace, and that goes for anybody. It is literally everywhere you look. And I think people are finally starting to find the courage to call it out. So, and thank you for all the tireless effort and work you put in as well, Derrick, because it just, it is a never ending job, as you know, and it's never, it never feels like you're doing enough, but it's like, we have to just keep pushing, because, I really do genuinely think we make a difference with everything that we do. And I mean, talking about everybody out there doing it, you reach people. Don't forget
Absolutely.
that. And I'll
thank
leave
you, brother. Thanks for having me on, man.
Always, man. I really do appreciate our conversations. I really find it, we always, I think we help more people to kind of put things in place, myself included, when we kind of overlap ideas. I'll end with a video from the Army about the whole PSYOP dynamic. Let's not forget the argument of, the world's a stage, like you're all actors in our play, kind of a sentiment from the Israeli intelligence. Well, our Army, or just the US intelligence, also has a very similar view about how the world plays out, and think about how this view might reflect on everything else we discussed today. So thank you, Derrick. Anything else you want to shout out before we go?
No, just, thank you for having me on. I will be releasing the next final episodes of the Pyramid of Power very soon. So for those who are looking out for that, stay tuned. Thanks for everybody who's been supporting, and stay tuned for more of my work at theconsciousresistance.com.
And Last American Vagabond, we're not going away from that just yet. We have plenty more articles coming your way. I'm determined about that, as well as the fluoride follow-up coming up your way.
Absolutely.
So thank you. As always, everybody out there, question everything, come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
There is another very important phase of warfare. It has as its target not the body, but the mind of the enemy.
The target of psychological warfare is against the enemy's mind.
It is words and ideas.
The ammunition used by PSYWAR.
Its mission is to influence the thoughts of the enemy soldier, and at the same time
is expected and encouraged to study foreign languages and the social sciences such as history, economics, and sociology. He must have a broad and sympathetic understanding of all phases of human experience.
Gripping at my skin, the walls of night closing.
but the use of this force as an integral part of combat has now taken on new form.
Say my last goodbye.
These are the PSYWAR soldiers.